Let's talk about exceptions. Exceptions are a response to an exceptional circumstance. Let me show you what I mean. I will declare a string variable. I will say string new text, and then I will say this is some text, and then I will get a part of this text. So I will use substring method, which we already went over. And then I will say 8 to 4. By that I mean grab the 8th position, which is this one, and then count from that to a length of 4, which is going to grab the word sum. And this will work just fine. But what if I say 1000? Let's see what happens. I will start the application, and as you see, it says an unhandled exception of type, this is the type, occurred. And the actual information about the exception is here. Index and length must refer to a location within the string, which means that in this case we just provided something that was out of reach. And this is an exception, but it is an unhandled exception, meaning that we weren't able to account for it, and most importantly, we weren't able to catch it. This is very bad practice because it'll crash the application. So the user would then have to go and close the application entirely somehow and then reopen it up again. That's a very bad user experience. What we want to do is we want to be able to handle the exception and then keep the application moving and just log the exception so that we can fix the error once we get it. But we want to keep the application moving. And I will show you how to do that in my next video. But for now, let's just understand that an exception is a response to an exceptional circumstance, and also that an exception is just another type. So just like we had console class and we had the person class that we created, the custom type person, exception is just another type. Let's actually go ahead and create an exception here. I will say exception, my first exception equals new exception. See this? Let's actually right click and go to definition for exception. As you see, it's a public class. Don't worry about this because this is just inheritance, and we'll talk about that later. And exception is just another class, and we have methods that we can access. We have methods and properties, right, that we can use on the exception class. So that's very good to know because I want you to see the bigger picture here. I want you to see what's under the hood. But now we don't just have to rely on unhandled exceptions being thrown. We can actually throw exceptions ourselves manually. So let's go ahead and do that. I will take this out. Let me grab an input from a user. I will say string input equals console readline. And then I will convert the input into an integer. So I will say int converted number. And then remember how we did it? We used type int, and then we said try parse. Then we would pass in the input and then use the out reserved keyword and pass in converted number. So this would actually convert our string input into an integer. But you remember that try parse gave us back a Boolean value. So let's actually use that. Let's assign the value of this expression to a variable that we're about to declare. And I will say is converted successfully. Now I will use a conditional statement to check whether it was converted successfully or not. So I will say if is converted successfully, and then take a note of this. I'm using another operator here. This is the not operator. As you have noticed, I'm kind of sprinkling these operators throughout the course instead of me going over it in the operators and expressions video. And the reason for that is because I believe that this is much better learning when you're seeing these things being used in an actual code. So in the beginning, I gave you the general concept and definition of what expressions and operators were. But now I want you to see how they're being used individually in code. And you will see a lot more of them coming up in the rest of the videos. So that was just a quick note. And let me explain you what the not operator does. It basically takes the operand that we pass into it, which is a Boolean value or an expression, Boolean expression that evaluates to Boolean value, and it negates that value. So if is converted successfully as true, then it will become false. If it is false, then it will become true. Now, why am I doing this? The reason is because I want to say that if is converted successfully comes back as true, which means that it has been converted successfully, then I don't want this expression to evaluate to true. So this is converted successfully will be true, but it will be negated. And so the body of the conditional statement won't be executed, right? And if is converted successfully is false, which means that the conversion has been not successful, it failed, then I'm going to turn that into true, which in this case, this will satisfy the condition, and I will run the code in the body of the conditional statement. So now, what are we going to have in the body of the conditional statement? I'm going to say throw new exception, and then I'm going to pass in a message, and I'm going to say conversion was not successful. Nice. Now let's see how this would work. I'm going to breakpoint in the beginning and also at the end, just so that the console doesn't close, and I will start the application. Let's grab the input from the user, which is me, and I will pass in 90, which in this case it should work. See this? This is true. Now this true will be turned into false. So it's saying if is converted successfully is not true, only then do this, right? In this case, it's true. So I won't be going into the block. Now that's great. Now let's try to break it. I will start the application and then step over it and then give it a textual value. Now let's try to convert it, and it's going to say false. Now false will be negated and it will become true. So in this case, the condition will be satisfied. In this case, it will say that the conversion was not successful. So you can now imagine that it will throw the exception, which it does. And you see, once again, an unhandled exception has been thrown. But in this case, we have manually threw this exception, and it says conversion was not successful. There you go. One good way to think of the not operator, because I know it could be confusing, whenever you see not, almost convert it into a word. So this not, you would read it as is converted successfully, is not converted successfully. You can almost read it like that, right? So you can kind of imagine this in your mind, and that will clarify what it stands for. But it's a little bit more cryptic, so you have to put the exclamation mark, which stands for not, and then you have to kind of imagine in your mind what it actually means. But in this case, that's all it says. If it is not successful, then do this, right? And if it is, then just continue the application. One last thing is, very quickly, I want to go over the formatting of how we're throwing an exception. As you can notice, we have a new reserved keyword, which says throw, and then we just construct a new exception, which this will just create a new exception value, and then we throw that newly created exception. One thing you also might have noticed is that we can pass in things into our type. And this is a constructor. There is a constructor for the exception type. There are actually a couple of constructors. This is not the only one, but we will be going over constructors a little later. Just know for now that whenever you're creating an exception, you need to construct it, and you need to use the reserved keyword throw, and you can pass in your own custom message.